Paul come up and talk about the global burden of disease.
Thank you very much, Derek. Well, thank you very much, firstly, to UCL and the Lancet for this invitation to participate in this meeting. I'm actually a fellow of the London College, honorary albeit, but it's the first time I've had the opportunity to talk here, and so I'm very excited on this occasion. And so I'm to talk about the global burden of diabetes, and I'm not going to talk too much about statistics, so there'll be a little bit of general stuff and a bit of travelogue stuff. And one of the questions which I think stands out, and it's still a bit debatable, and arguably is actually diabetes the biggest epidemic in human history. And I'd like to cover a number of areas: the question of the global statistics, drivers of the epidemic, some issues on the prevention of diabetes, and a new paradigm and perspective in terms of the longer-term history of this epidemic, and perhaps some words on changing the upward trajectory of the epidemic, how we might go about it. Just a few little quotes that Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, said that this is a public health emergency emerging in slow motion. A joint initiative by the IDF and the International Obesity Group pointed out that the twin epidemics of obesity and diabetes represent the biggest public health challenge of the 21st century. And a bit of promotional publicity by the IDF. They said if the world's most populated countries, that certainly China, India, but diabetes would be the third most populated if it was a country. It was pointed out some years ago by the IDF that half of all the people with diabetes in the world are in three countries: China, India, and USA. And China, this is in 2013, they pointed out it was just below 100 million people. The latest data from China suggests that there's something like 125 to 135 million people with diabetes in China alone. I'm not going to talk too much about the cost of the epidemic, but this obviously is a question, part of the burden. And George Washington was very concerned about this, and the US spent nearly $612 billion on diabetes in 2014, but a very reliable international journal more recently pointed out in 2016, the Lancet, the global cost of diabetes is now $825 billion annually. Now, it was very interesting. I was just a few days before I left, I came across a very interesting report, Bending the Curve on Urban Diabetes, which in fact, when I actually read through it, I realized it actually was coming out of UCL, in fact. And I think it's just I'll mention a little bit more about it, but it's a report, a multinational group, many cities around the world, looking at the problem of diabetes in cities, and in fact projecting that if the curve was changed, you'll see here on the slide that they show what the predicted curve would be if things didn't change. Sorry, here. But if things changed, in fact, you would reduce the prevalence of diabetes in 2045, and there was some stuff on the actual change in the cost of diabetes, and I'll refer to that right at the end of my presentation. But a very interesting study indeed. This is the two scenarios which I'll talk about right at the end of my presentation. Well, trying to project what the global burden is numerically has been a challenge. My own group actually started doing the projections just before the year 2000. The IDF and WHO then rolled into the picture, and in the year 2000 they presented these data: 189 million people in 2000, and in 2030 it would rise to 324. Well, just remember the actual prediction for 2030, which is some years off yet, as 324 million. The latest predictions by the IDF in 2017 have far exceeded what was actually projected back in the year 2000 as to what the problem would be. Now, there are some problems with these figures, which I'm going to mention, but there's clearly a major escalation in diabetes over the last few decades internationally. Now, I just put this in 1978, a group of rather distinguished diabetologists met at the Kroc Foundation in San Bernardino, the headquarters of McDonald's hamburgers, but that's irrelevant in this context, and discussed the classification and diagnostic criteria for diabetes. And you'll see in this here some of the most distinguished people in diabetes: the late Harry Keane, Peter Bennett, John Jarrett, another Londoner, Kelly West. I somehow snuck in at the back there, but these were the big guys at the time. And we came up with key recommendations which became the basis of the WHO diagnostic criteria for diabetes. And the reason for this meeting was to try and get everyone who was doing prevalence and incidence studies to use the same diagnostic criteria for diabetes. It was successful for a few years, but it's now become a total mess. And this is one of the reasons we have to be very cautious about the numerical data we're providing now, particularly the IDF and WHO and the global burden of diabetes, because many countries in the world do not have national data. So the IDF picks on another country which may be similar, using those data for the global predictions. Now, the problem is, as I said, many countries don't have national data, and so whatever is being put out by IDF and WHO, etc., are clearly underestimates. And trying to get around this problem, WHO developed a program called the STEPS program, which is also not so great. And one of its major problems is the data for prevalence of diabetes are based solely on fasting blood glucose. And fasting blood glucose, by many studies, underestimates by at least 25 to 30% the actual figure if it was compared with an oral glucose tolerance test. And I'll just give you an example. I think the best example is for Malawi, where there are no diabetes studies. They used Botswana, Mozambique, and South Africa as the countries that they would extrapolate what the problem was in Malawi. And you can see in Eritrea it's also not so hot, and Brunei, again. These are some of the problems encountered by the global burden story. And so I just wanted to summarize: the IDF and WHO have serious limitations, so you have to be very careful. And this is more for Richard Horton and his colleagues. The journal editors need to be much more critical of the use of these data. In nearly every paper put out these days by diabetes investigators cites data from WHO or IDF, and and our researchers putting in research grants, the same story, and in fact it's all a little bit loose still at this stage. So I just wanted to mention to you how this epidemic came to realization. Studies in the Pima Indians in the United States and our own island studies, the Pacific Islands, and studies in Mauritius. Derek's been very much involved in Mauritius at certain stages with us, allowed us to predict many, many years ago that there would be an epidemic of diabetes. The first suggestion actually came from Ian Pryor back in about 1966 in New Zealand Maoris, Peter Bennett, Pima Indians. Later on, Peter Wise, a former Australian, came here to London as a consultant, did a study in Australian Indigenous people and showed a very high rate of diabetes. It was so unpopular, I think Peter decided it was better to get out of Australia and come to the UK, where he became a very popular figure in the diabetes field. And then our studies in the Pacific island of Nauru then showed the highest rate of diabetes in the world, higher actually than the Pima Indians. And here are the data published in Diabetologia in 1977. And with WHO criteria, 34% of people 18 years and over had diabetes, another 11.3 had pre-diabetes. So this was quite a big thing to have a bit of fuss about, and our local newspaper, The Age, ran this story about Western killer in paradise. Now, the Western killer, of course, was meant to be diabetes, because there was diabetes in Tonga and Samoa. And unfortunately, they called me the Captain Cook of diabetes, and in fact, the message was lost, but that's a... I became very interested in island situations, and then we picked on Mauritius as the next place to study diabetes, as there were reports of higher rates of diabetes and cardiovascular disease in that community. And we started surveying in Mauritius in the mid-80s, and I just put up a former president of the college, Sir George Alberti. Professor Sir George Alberti was one of the key members of the team. Jonathan Shaw, who joined our group from Manchester, has been involved more recently in those studies. And this is the pattern of what happened in Mauritius in a community of 1.6 million people, 3 ethnic groups. These 3 ethnic groups constitute 2/3 of the world's population. And we took studies there, serial studies, the most recent study in 2015. And the pattern you can see here, the rise from 1987 through to 2009, I haven't got the latest data here, showed a 62% increase in diabetes over that period. And this obviously was very important in the context of looking at China, looking at India and Africa, where these people's origins actually were, predicting that in those communities we'd see very high rates of diabetes in time. We looked at the all-cause mortality in the 3 different ethnic groups here, the Indian, the Creole, African origin people, and the Chinese. And you can see with increasing degrees of glucose intolerance, the increase in all-cause mortality, exactly similar despite the ethnic group. This article appeared in Diabetes Care, actually, and the point of the article, just to show you, was that the conclusion was this is, I put in arguably because I've become much more conservative in these days, the first study in a developing country of the impact of glucose tolerance on mortality in African populations, in an African population, and one of the first studies in South Asian populations, and again showed the impact of mortality in relation to diabetes. And obviously Mauritius, this very small island of 1.6 million, gave a lot of information on the global patterns that we might expect in the future from diabetes. So, for example, very early studies back in 1972 showed relatively low prevalence rates of diabetes in urban India. This slide was given to me by Professor Mohan from Chennai. But if you have a look at communities, if you look at the Indian diaspora, you can see that in nearly every country where people from India migrated to, up to 5-6-fold increases of the prevalence of diabetes. Already, in fact, sort of a justification of the prediction that within India, over time, there would be very high rates of diabetes. And of course, India changed a lot. We saw the process of Coca-Colanization, and The Herald Tribune ran this big story, India increasing crippled by the sugar disease. I won't show you the basic data, but there's tons of data from Ramachandran's group and Mohan's group of the very high rates now of diabetes in India in the 15 to 20% prevalence range. And I was actually quoted as saying I was concerned that this is a pattern that we're going to see in the future, and we won't have, many countries will not have the resources to grapple with this growing burden of diabetes. And of course, I mentioned China in the context of Mauritius, and between 1980, when I was actually in China, where there was virtually no diabetes, by the year 2009, there was something nearly 10% prevalence of diabetes, and it's gone higher since. And Reuters ran a story about a year ago now about the looming public health crisis threatened to take down China's healthcare system by now, which is something like 120 million people with diabetes alone in that country. That's 5 or 6 times the population of Australia with diabetes. And again, just one other example of the rise in diabetes, studies from Turkey by Satman and his group in blue. It's their first national study back in 1998, and 12 years later in 2010 you can see the rise in diabetes that's occurred in all of the age groups in Turkey. Now, one of the biggest concerns we have in terms of diabetes burden is for Indigenous communities around the world. And Australia, of course, has a large Indigenous community, and in Alice Springs, where we have a centre, a research centre, we have one of the highest rates of diabetes in the world, the highest rate of end-stage renal disease in the world, and actually Alice Springs has the largest renal dialysis unit per capita in the Southern Hemisphere. And if you go into that unit, it's nearly all Indigenous people. And these are data shown here. The gold or yellow is the AusDiab study that I undertook in the year 2000 in Australia, the age-specific rates. And here are 2 Indigenous communities in Australia. You can see the differences. And this fall off here isn't because there are less people with diabetes in the older age group. It's due to the increased mortality from diabetes that occurs in these communities. And coming to end-stage renal disease, you can see since 1990 to 2009, this incredible escalation in terms of long-term end-stage renal disease and the huge demands put on these communities and the governments, obviously, in terms of dealing with this huge problem from diabetes. Now, this problem is replicated elsewhere. This slide, I believe, came from a review by Stuart Harris from Canada, and for New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and America, looking at Indigenous communities against the non-Indigenous people, and you can see the huge increase in mortality in these Indigenous communities. And I think we're very lucky here today to have this gentleman, Bernie Zinman, who's going to tell us about some of the therapies now available that may help reverse these trends, actually. Bernie got very upset with me, actually, because I was doing a lecture tour with him and he was telling me about his work in Sandy Lake, and everywhere I went I was saying Sandy Beach, and he grabbed me and said, no, it's Sandy Lake, Sandy Lake. But terrific work done by him and his group in Canada. So looking now at the question of preventing the diabetes or reducing the burden of the epidemic, there are obviously a lot of social and demographic factors involved. And nearly every country in the world, diabetes is increasing, but there are several instances. One of them is in Cuba, where there was an economic turndown in the mid-90s, and you can just see here these figures in this period here falls in actual diabetes prevalence, diabetes incidence and diabetes mortality published in the BMJ. So there certainly was a downturn in relation to an economic crisis. The island of Nauru that I mentioned to you that we studied back in 1994 and saw this very high prevalence of diabetes in this specific age group. In 2004, there was in this period there was a huge economic downturn in Nauru, which was a very rich phosphate country. And you can see here that that age group, there was a fall in this and the other age groups in diabetes. So clearly, and during World War II, of course, there was falls in diabetes in countries in Europe that's been well demonstrated. But one thing's very clear, many countries, many developing countries around the world where there's severe poverty, and there are a whole number of factors here which actually act as drivers or accompany diabetes, and surely chronic disease itself enhances poverty. And I'll be talking about the perinatal and prenatal story. The fact many cases are undiagnosed, the countries cannot afford the facility to educate or manage people with diabetes. So it's a very difficult situation, and it's very nice for us to live in the UK or Australia or the United States, which aren't necessarily perfect, but our populations get a better deal. I just wanted to talk to you, there's a lot of talk about how we can prevent diabetes by losing weight, and exercise, the DPP and the Finnish prevalence study, the Finnish intervention study, etc. And there has been very little focus until recently on the issue of early development and the impact in utero. David Barker started the story, he might have, and I think he had the right idea for the wrong reasons in some part, but it's become a critical part of our thinking now in terms of prevention of diabetes, that the fetus in the womb can be exposed by a whole number of risk factors, including diabetes. That we know that a woman with diabetes, the child is actually more likely to have diabetes from the PIMA study. And the actual changes, the epigenetic changes, which I'll mention, are actually intergenerational. So they can continue to drive this epidemic, and it becomes very important now for us to put a much greater focus on maternal and child health if we're hoping to turn down this major international epidemic. I won't go into details in epigenetics, but it's changes in gene expression that occur independent of changes in the sequence, and DNA methylation and histone modification are two mechanisms. And you actually see this situation where a number of environmental factors, as I've shown just earlier, can affect gene expression and set a baby up for diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, even mental health issues such as schizophrenia in adult life. And this all goes back to the Dutch winter famine. I'm sure many of you will know that at the end of World War II, when the Netherlands was still under Nazi occupation, there was a famine. When someone studied the children who were born at that time during the famine, when they were in adult life, they found higher rates of diabetes, obesity, and hypertension. The same story was replicated in China, the Mao famine at the end of the 1950s. And it's quite possible that this huge change in diabetes in China between 1980 that we are now seeing may in fact be the heavy footprint of that famine that occurred some 50, 60 years previously. And that just brings me to this story of famines and type 2 diabetes. We're seeing famines now in the Horn of Africa. The latest big one is in Yemen. And it's raising questions now, what will happen to these communities if the economic situation changes in the future, and that these places may actually become the hotspots in the future where the big epidemics of diabetes are. And we may control them in the United States by people jogging and losing weight, but unless we start looking more deeply at the situation in many developing countries, it may be a long time before we actually pull this epidemic back. So we have to keep on asking the question, where may the next big epidemics be, even if we're looking 30 or 40 years down the track? And I just wanted to wind up basically with this picture, and I think it's time, and we know that The Lancet has a very high social responsibility factor, that the international and national NGOs who are rushing aid into emergency crises, famines and fires and floods and such like, they're doing the right thing, trying to help and save lives, but the question is, what are the long-term outcomes of the sort of aid that they bring into these communities, and whether we shouldn't be asking questions at this time, because it may well be that all we're doing is perpetuating these diabetes epidemics. Oh, this one doesn't want to show. Diabetes, in my mind, is the greatest epidemic in human history. It's certainly the greatest numbers that we know. It's probably the greatest cost, and it's not over yet. And I was very interested to come across this initiative that I believe has come out, Derek, of University College, Bending the Curve on Diabetes. And they've raised the question, looking at the trajectory of diabetes out to, I think it was 2045, if nothing is done, we'll see these figures are 1.4 billion adults with diabetes, 736 million adults living with diabetes, and the cost over, well, $1,076 billion US globally. But if in fact action is taken to reduce the slant of that curve, that we'll see 111 million fewer cases of diabetes globally, we'll see much lower costs of diabetes, and that this certainly is a very nice way to start thinking about addressing what I still believe is the greatest epidemic in human history. But I just wanted to leave you with a message that I think dealing with the early development issues, the maternal and child health issue, the epigenetic outcomes of poor maternal health, for example, is something that will continue to drive this epidemic no matter how many community-based exercise and weight reduction programs we have. And just finally, I'd like to acknowledge some of the people that I've worked with, international people involved, George Alberti, Stefan Soderberg from Sweden, Jaakko Tiimalaito, who you know is the guru of diabetes prevention from Finland, and the Mercian team. Thank you.